Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest Fleet World webinar, Making EVs Work Beyond the Business Case. I'm Simon Harris, editor of Fleet World and EV Fleet World, and I'm delighted to see so many of you joining us today. For many fleets, the question of whether to electrify has already been answered. The harder questions come next. How do you make EVs work reliably in day-to-day operations? How do you manage the costs as they evolve? And how do you build a strategy that holds up when the market around you keeps shifting? That is exactly what we're here to explore this morning. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll be looking at the practical realities of running an electric fleet beyond the initial business case, the operational friction, the data, the funding challenges, and the strategic decisions that determine whether electrification actually delivers. I'm joined today by three experts who work with fleet operators on precisely these challenges every day. Edwin Kemp is a director at EY Parthenon, where he advises businesses on fleet strategy and sustainability. Mel Creedy is electric vehicle business development manager at Northgate Vehicle Hire, working with operators on the practical realities of EV transition. And Abhinav Basu is associate vice president of solutions engineering for EMEA at Geotab, bringing a data and technology perspective to how fleets can get more from their electric vehicles once they're in service. So let's get started. I'll invite each speaker to introduce themselves and talk a little about what they do, starting with Edwin.
Thank you, Simon. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Edwin Kemp. I'm a director at EY Parthenon. As Simon mentioned, EY Parthenon is our global strategy consultancy, bringing together 25,000 professionals across 150 markets, and we help organizations develop growth strategies, navigate transformation, and make investment decisions with confidence, drawing on our sector expertise and broader capabilities in transactions, technology, and transformation. And from a fleet perspective, as Simon was outlining, we help fleet, mobility, and automotive businesses respond to strategic changes and challenges, including electrification, changing vehicle economics, and new mobility models. And so we work with fleet operators, the vehicle manufacturers themselves, leasing companies, and others to develop practical strategies and improve operational performance, and then make confident investment decisions off the back of it.
Thank you, Edwin. And Mel?
Yeah, I'm Mel Creedy. I work in Northgate Vehicle Hire as EV specialist, EV business development manager. My role is solely to support our customers on their journey to transition, and that is everything to looking at their telematics data from their journey profiles all the way to engaging with their drivers and beyond.
Thank you, Mel. And last but certainly not least, Abhinav.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Simon, for the introduction. I'm Abhinav. I work with Geotab. Geotab, our role and our goal is to underpin the technology layer across everything when it comes to vehicle telematics, and that, EVs being a very key part of it. We want to be the ecosystemic partner that is able to bring in and capture all the data that is required for fleets to make their decisions, whether it be EVs or whether it be charging. And my specific role is, I consult very much on the technology side with all of our customers and fleets on the best way that they can use the technology. We have about 6 million plus vehicles connected globally and over 1 million vehicles in Europe now. So that gives us a very substantial base on which to build a little bit of a data-driven story and a data-driven dynamic that fleets can work with. Pleasure to be here and look forward to the conversation.
So let's move on to our discussion. We'll start with a question for Edwin. The original EV business case was built on assumptions about energy costs, residual values, and incentive frameworks that have all shifted significantly. From a strategic advisory perspective, what does a genuinely robust EV business case look like in 2026, both for the fleet operator and the wider ecosystem? And what variables are fleet decision makers most commonly underestimating?
So I think for me, the EV business case in 2026 needs to be much more dynamic than prior versions. So previous generations, the case was often built on simple assumptions around electricity staying at a certain price, residual values holding, and incentives remaining broadly supportive. And I think it's probably fair to say that all three have become more volatile recently. So for me, a robust business case today isn't a single total cost of ownership calculation. It's a scenario-based investment case that stress tests those assumptions around energy prices, around charging mix, around utilization, residual values, downtime, and indeed policy changes and infrastructure deployment timing. We ran some research earlier in the year, and it shows that the case is still compelling. So we showed that fleet electrification in Europe could unlock up to 246 billion of cumulative operating cost savings by 2030. And that was through things like 50% plus lower energy costs and 20 to 40% reductions in scheduled servicing and maintenance expenditure. It's important to stress that that value is not automatic. It depends on how the fleet is operated and how the wider ecosystem around it is structured. And so I think for me, the mistake is treating EVs as a simple procurement decision. The question being, is this vehicle cheaper than the diesel or petrol equivalent? I think the better question is, can this vehicle route, charging pattern, energy contract and financing model deliver a more resilient cost advantage over the asset's life? And I think that the variables most often underestimated there include the charging mix, because depot, home, workplace, etc. produce very different economics. Utilization and duty cycles would be another, because EVs typically reward more predictable routes with higher mileage, for example. Downtime and operational resilience would be another one. You're looking at things like charger uptime, grid connections, and servicing behavior there, and they all matter. And then residual values, so where the battery state of health certification, battery passports, buybacks and guarantees are becoming important commercial tools, not just sort of technical add-ons. And I think I'll probably add one final point on this one. So a robust business case should recognize that fleet electrification is an ecosystem opportunity, not just for the individual business. So it creates demand certainty for OEMs, it creates utilization for charge point operators, new models for finance providers, and indeed new flexibility options for the energy system. And that's where the strategic value sits. So it's no longer a business case built on EV versus ICE. It's integrated fleet economics versus legacy fleet economics for me.
Thanks, Edwin. Mel, Edwin's outlined how the financial case has become more complex. From Northgate's position, working with fleet operators every day, where are you seeing the gap between what the business case promises and what actually happens when the vehicles go into service?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I totally agree with everything Edwin said. I think we've seen a complete evolution of how we approach electrification. We look at a lot of data, we do a lot of work ahead of our operators taking EVs, but things change, things evolve, business models change, the political landscape changes as well. So again, going back to what Edwin says, it's preparing that driver or that operator for all scenarios. Where we see is things like downtime, which could come from anywhere. A charger being down, a charger being in use, and being able to build that scenario and that solution ahead of that actually happening is really key for us. So the driver piece and the driver education is very close to my heart and the business's heart, in terms of making sure we're equipping the boots on the ground, so to speak. We carry out analysis using telematics, and we are able to build varying scenarios, whether that is home charging, workplace or depot charging, and that then can lead on to making the right recommendations, and also en route and destination charging. So we can factor in commercial impact, downtime, and what that looks like commercially, and for those operatives on the ground and the people that are looking after those operatives, to make sure that the job that needs doing is being done just in an electric vehicle.
Thank you, Mel. Yeah, Abhinav, Mel's touched on driver engagement and vehicle suitability as recurring sticking points. When Geotab analyzes telematics data from fleets that have already made the transition, Does the data confirm those friction points, or does it tell a different story?
Thanks, Simon. I think first of all, I'd say Edwin made a very good point. It's about integrated fleet economics, and Mel spoke about the driver engagement and the downtime. So let me give you an idea of that. So first of all, I think the data does confirm one of those friction points clearly, but what it also gives you is a bit more of a reassuring verdict on the second. So I'll break it down into two pieces. So let's talk about vehicle suitability first. So post-transition fleet telemetry, what we're seeing is broadly encouraging. So across European commercial fleets where Geotab works, EVs are completing their assigned routes. Range anxiety that was dominating, the pre-transition conversation, it doesn't really show up as a pattern of operational failure once the vehicles are actually in service. What we also see is the typical daily mileage of a European LCV sits within the range of what modern BEVs actually deliver, and this accounts for things like temperature, load variation, and all of that. So vehicle suitability as an ongoing friction point is not really what the data confirms. But on the driver engagement side, we have a slightly different picture. So the data confirms, but the form it takes is a bit more specific. It's not that the drivers are rejecting it, it's more of caution. So across the European fleets, what we're seeing is that an average daily depth discharge of just 48%. What this means in simple layman's terms is the average EV goes home each night with about half of its battery unused. That's 50% of energy just lying there that could have been used in a more efficient manner. So what we're seeing is fleet managers are routing EVs to the lightest jobs. Drivers are plugging in very early. Diesel is absorbing the demanding runs. So, the longer runs, the more kind of demanding, extenuous runs, diesel vehicles are actually absorbing that. And that pattern is very consistent and very measurable. It has a direct financial consequence as well. So if you're operating at 48% of discharge, you're roughly capturing half the fuel savings, half the emission reduction, half the financial return that the transition was actually supposed to deliver. So the thought process for a transition was good and it's happened, but the usage of that transition, we're seeing a slightly lower variability on that. So it actually confirms both the friction points sort of equally. It settles that the fact that the suitability argument is a good argument and it's been successful, but it surfaces the driver engagement in a sharper, more quantifiable form. And this, I think, is a very important thing for the likes of Mel to actually consider when you're working with the various fleets. So that's kind of what we are able to see, and we have some tools that actually help with that. The EV performance tool, the charge monitoring tool, it gives you kind of real-time insights into how you can actually manage that in a more efficient manner.
Abin have shown that the data tells us a great deal about how EVs perform in the real world in fleet conditions. How should fleet managers use that operational evidence to identify where to move now and to build the case internally to maintain momentum when the regulatory environment around the mandate keeps shifting?
I think Abhinav described the real world data environment really well there. Just in terms of the regulation perspective, so I think it probably goes without saying that uncertainty is real and it will probably continue for the foreseeable for now. But I'd be careful not to let that become an excuse for inaction. The value of the real world fleet data is that it moves the debate from ideology into investable reality for me. So fleet managers should look to use that data to answer three questions really for me. So the first is, which parts of our fleet are ready to transition now? So not every use case will electrify at the same pace. And that's why our research looks at different vehicle archetypes, so cars, LCVs, heavy goods vehicles, because that readiness varies across those duty cycles. And for example, last mile vans with predictable routes and overnight depot return are often a much stronger starting point than complex long haul operations. I think the second point for me here would be, where are the economics already working? So the study I mentioned previously in partnership with Euroelectric showed that the clear OPEX advantages exist in several use cases. So I think we had an example in there from France where EV-based car fleets show a 33% operating cost advantage versus ICE equivalents. Electric LCVs, it was about 40% advantage, and then heavy goods vehicles, about a 14% advantage on the modelled intra-France routes in this case. But I think the point is that not every route works today, and it's the data out there that can show precisely where the case is already credible. And then the third question I think fleet managers should be answering or looking to answer is, where's the opportunity to scale? So data tells you where vehicles dwell, where charging can be controlled, where grid capacity is constrained, and where public charging exposure is too high, and where the downtime risk sits. So bringing that all together, I think the internal case should therefore be phased. So start with a fleet suitability map, validate it through real operational pilots, and then link the scaling roadmap to replacement cycles, depot upgrades, energy procurement, and grid connection timelines. And I think that also matters because fleets are a demand lever for the wider market. So fleet procurement decisions shape, OEM production volumes, they shape charging utilization, they shape the second-hand market. So it's important across the ecosystem. And when the mandate keeps evolving, data becomes increasingly important, not less. So regulation may move, but evidence gives you almost a no-regret pathway, where to electrify now, where to wait, and what needs to be solved before you think about scaling.
Mel, Edwin talks about building resilience into strategy when policy is uncertain. In practical terms, how is Northgate helping customers make decisions about vehicle procurement and fleet composition when neither the regulatory picture nor the residual value outlook is settled?
Yeah, and I think I echo everything Edwin has said there in terms of a really robust strategy. That means you can start the journey. So your easy wins or your low-hanging fruit. And a lot of that is, again, you probably will hear me talking a lot about drivers, but also finding those EV champions within that cohort of drivers as well that are going to get on board, that are going to get on that journey with you or with our customers. I suppose the beauty that we have really in Northgate is that we know our fleets quite intimately. So we have worked with a lot of our customers for a long time, and therefore we can really understand that fleet in a granular manner and what the usages are. So my role is to work with the account managers and those customers. And again, I identify that sort of starting point, but build out that more challenging route as well. And we're able to pull in data as well as driver response, and our driver's response is not just around the practicalities of charging, it is also around sentiment and concerns, and we all have our own world that we live in, and one person's concern is very different from another's. So just being able to have that insight means we can give the right advice, and we can also target the right education piece for the drivers. In terms of the risks with residuals, we are a very agile business. So obviously the assets are ours, so we take that risk. But also if business models change, we're able to react to that quite quickly and support our customers. And that could very well mean one of our customers wins a contract and there is a demand for electric vehicles on there. We need to make sure that we're supporting that, but also we're making those vehicles operational. We are doing the due diligence around the duty cycle and the driver piece, but it may very well work the other way around. Their business model changes and we have to revert back to newer diesels. There's still a carbon saving, but maybe not where we like to be. And I think having the integrity to be able to say, and back to Edwin's point, this is not going to be this may not work for all of your fleet at this moment in time. There may be charging infrastructure challenges, driver challenges, or simply that the vehicle is too complex to proceed. So I think we're able to give that true insight and make sure that we're doing the right thing with our customers.
Mel has drawn a distinction between the applications where EVs are delivering and those where the technology isn't quite there yet. Once those vehicles are in service, how does managing an electric fleet differ from managing an ICE fleet in terms of what the data is telling you, and what new metrics should fleet managers be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to touch on a point Mel made, which I think is very important. The driver sentiment and engagement is absolutely critical. I think a lot of people underestimate how demanding the job is of a fleet driver. I mean, I've worked with many of them, and it is a very demanding job, right? And when you're switching vehicles, I think it's important that we as a collective are really helping and enabling them to use that vehicle in the most efficient manner. How do you drive? What's the best way to drive it? Where you can get maximum input and output from the vehicle. So the data does tell some interesting stories, but I think more than what the data tells about what the driver should do, I think it's more a management philosophy. It's not just about introducing new metrics, but what it does is that ICE management had some decisions that have been made over the years, but EVs have completely different decisions that really need to be made. And we start with a very simple one, state of charge. When you look at state of charge, I think a lot of people look at it as similar to a fuel gauge, but this is a stark difference. 30%, let's say your diesel engine's at 30% fuel level, that's 1 10-minute stop away from being filled up. But on an EV, it's completely different. It might be okay. 30% might be okay for tomorrow's routes, depending on the dwell time. Or depending on tomorrow's routes, you may need to jump the charging queue. So these are all very management and business decisions that need to be made. And I think the education of the drivers around that piece is a critical component that actually helps them use these vehicles well, because they look at the vehicle as their office, right? That's their office, that's their workplace. So we want to keep them on the road as much as possible, reduce the downtime. All of these things are very, very critical. So we shouldn't really look at SOC in isolation as one of those metrics. You need to connect it to the route planning, the charger availability, the overcharging, and stop dispatching on anxiety, rather dispatch on planned routing. I already touched upon depth of discharge, but that basically, just to labor that specific point, what you're basically doing with a depth of discharge of 48% and the vehicle's going to be parked up at night, you're doing half of the productive work that the vehicle's actually capable of, right? And that, I don't think, is a vehicle-related problem. That is more a fleet operational problem, right? So, Mel touched upon being very close to the customers and understanding, and I think doing those things really help you understand, is this customer okay with a 48% depth of discharge versus the other one where we can push that to, say, 20 or 80, whichever way it goes. Then you look at energy consumption. Energy consumption in kilowatt hour per 100 kilometers replaces liters per 100 kilometers. And we did a recent study called the European Freight Efficiency Index for urban cities. So we chose 7 cities, very, very interesting study. All of our data scientists got really deeply engaged in it. And we did Berlin, Amsterdam, Dublin, Rome, Paris, London, and Madrid in that order. London ranks 7th, right? And the reason London ranks 7th was because of the stop-start pattern of London traffic. It's sometimes very unpredictable, right? It's very unpredictable on where you'd have clogs in London versus where you'd have free-flowing traffic. And with trucks, for example, we recorded the lowest idle fuel ratio of like 11.1%. So that stop-start pattern actually destroys the efficiency of what a diesel can do. Whereas for the EVs, it's kind of opposite, because deceleration creates regenerative braking. You're actually helping energy go back in. So it's a slightly different architecture, which I think needs to be studied a little bit more. And then you look at state of health, which is another metric now. When you look at that, we studied about 22,000 odd vehicles, and we found that vehicles that rely on high power DC fast charging, and let's connect that back to the management principles that I was talking about earlier, anxiety-based charging, high-powered DC charging, they degraded 3% per year versus the slow chargers, which degraded 1.5%. And this is from real-world data, from vehicles that are operating as fleets around the world. Now, what that means in an 8-year range is you're roughly moving from retaining 76% of your battery capacity instead of the 88% of the original capacity now, because of the DC fast charging, which is degrading at a 3% rate. So now when you look at the longevity of the vehicle and even things like second life, you're starting to impact all of those by anxiously made decisions or rapidly made decisions on a whim rather than being a bit more proactive. So I don't think these metrics are not really a new checklist as such. These are more of a management philosophy that needs to come through, slightly different from diesels. And then we can go into maintenance as well. Mel mentioned downtime, very different maintaining an EV to maintaining a diesel vehicle. In diesel vehicles, you have things like the exhaust system, for instance, you have to maintain that. But on an EV, you've got the battery, you've got the charging infrastructure that affects the vehicle's downtime itself. Then you've got, the tires, wear and tear of the tires, wear and tear of the brakes. EVs are quite zippy if you've ever driven one. So there's a bit more of a zip to it, which all relates back to the behavior of the driver and how you kind of engage with them and coach them.
Coming back to Edwin, as organizations face increasing pressure around Scope 1 and Scope 3 emissions reporting, how should fleet managers position themselves within the broader corporate sustainability and value creation framework? And how does granular operational data feed into that conversation at board level?
I think this is where the role of the fleet manager changes quite fundamentally. So historically, fleet was seen as an operational cost center, vehicles, fuel, maintenance, etc. But with Scope 1 and Scope 3 reporting, fleet's becoming a strategic source of carbon, cost, energy, and supplier data. And so I think for many organizations, fleet emissions are one of the most tangible parts of the decarbonisation agenda. They're measurable. We've been describing that collectively throughout this session. They're operationally addressable and they're linked directly to efficiency. And I think that gives fleet managers a much stronger role in the corporate sustainability conversation. The board doesn't need raw telematics, right? The board needs decision grade insight. AI and analytics can turn the various data sources across the vehicle, the routes, the charging, etc., into, I think, 3 things the board probably cares about. So the first would be carbon impacts. What emissions are we reducing, from which parts of the fleet, and at what pace? Secondly, cost and capital allocation. So where is electrification reducing total cost of ownership, and where should we prioritize vehicles, depots, chargers, energy contracts, and grid upgrades for investment? And then thirdly, risk and resilience. So what's our exposure to diesel and petrol price volatility, to carbon pricing, to clean air zones, to customer requirements? We've spoken about that as well, and residual value risk and infrastructure constraints. I think that also matters for Scope 3, right? So many organizations have transport emissions outside their own fleet. They have outsourced logistics, they have subcontracted delivery or supplier transportation. Fleet managers can use their own operational data, I think, to set credible requirements for their suppliers as well, around emissions per kilometre, around vehicle type, around charging source, route efficiency, and ultimately the quality of reporting. I think there's also a commercial angle here. As depots, car parks, and logistics sites become charging assets, that data can support smarter energy procurement, better charger utilization, flexibility opportunities, and I guess in time, new revenue models. And so I think for me, the strategic positioning here is clear. Fleets should become the operational engine room of transport decarbonisation. It connects that sustainability ambition into real, visible assets, real routes, real energy use, and real costs ultimately. And so I think at the board level, and this is where the fleet managers can play the role in communicating up to the board, the conversation shouldn't be we need to electrify because the regulation is telling us to do so. It should be fleet electrification gives us a measurable route to reduce emissions, to control energy costs, to protect customer and city access, to improve our supplier engagement, and ultimately strengthen sustainability reporting.
Edwin's made the case for fleet managers as strategic contributors at board level. What would you say to a fleet manager who feels that the strategic ambition is running ahead of what's practically achievable on the ground right now? And what does genuine driver buy-in actually look like when a transition is working well?
You're absolutely right. I think the fleet electrification is a great start to a knock-on effect for a fully sustainable business and a well-rounded sustainable business. And again, from a reporting point of view, You can go as far back as the energy provider that you're using to report on your carbon output really accurately. I think from a fleet manager and an operator's point of view and a driver's point of view, it's almost about giving them the reasons why the business is doing this and why they need to be on this journey sooner rather than later. And I think we've spoken about getting on that journey really early, getting those insights really early, and onboarding those drivers really, really early. But drivers are at the heart of this. They are driving that business. They are on the ground. They have their own challenges, whether they're in diesel or EV. And it's just really taking them on the journey. And from a social value point of view as well, if you're looking after their well-being and you are taking them with you, but also educating them, targeting the right kind of education, giving them the right tools, the right reimbursement model so that their energy is paid for and there is very little disruption to their own domestic life. But also the impact that they can have as well. If they are driving an EV, what impact are they having on their own environment immediately around their area and the area that they work in? And you will find, having looked at many driver surveys with the help of our Drive to Zero team, you will find that this is important to a lot of people, our environment and where we're going on a sustainability route. It is important, not to everybody, and everybody's got different views, but there are those EV champions and there are those people that want to be part of this. So I really believe getting that insight. And if you have got people that are resisting it, that is an education piece, and that is just making sure that they've got that information and they've got that education and access to it. And I think we all know, I think probably everybody on this call, on this webinar, are driving EVs. We all know once you're in it and once you get over that little bit of anxiety, you probably wouldn't go back to a diesel vehicle. I know that I wouldn't. Yeah, I think it's drivers, but I think it's the sustainability team and a fleet operator team talking and having really open discussions so they can communicate what the various different challenges is. But sometimes an operator will say they think it's easy, and we all know it's not. And I think having that interaction, I think, is really, really key.
Mel has described what successful EV adoption looks like from an operational perspective. When you look at telematics data from fleets where drivers have fully embraced EVs versus those where resistance has persisted, is there a measurable difference in outcomes? And what does that tell us about where the industry needs to focus, say, over the next 3 to 5 years?
The gap from what we're seeing is definitely stark enough to be very commercially significant. The signal that I mentioned at the beginning was that depth of discharge, right? So in fleets where we've got EVs that have been, where EVs have been genuinely embraced, with the champions, depth of discharge is measurably higher and the difference is real. So we're seeing lower energy cost per kilometer, we're seeing faster paybacks, and Edwin mentioned sustainability and emissions. We're seeing actual rather than theoretical emission reductions. So we ran another study recently, and some of those things are quite interesting. So this was more on the truck side. So we're seeing electric trucks from various different manufacturers. They all operated above 100% depth of discharge daily, taking on regional and long haul routes, right? So what we see with trucks is there's a lot more discipline, I think, when it comes to trucks, just based on the fact and the nature of the business that they run, and that is a very stark difference that we see. So I don't think it's a technology gap as such. It's more a confidence gap, like Mel was saying. Once you get over those initial hurdles, I think I would never go back to a diesel as well. I worked on diesel vehicles for many years, but after driving EVs, I would never go back. I mean, unless someone gave me a Lamborghini to drive around a track, that's a very different conversation altogether. So resistance has persisted, but I think the data is equally consistent. So low depth of discharge EVs on the shortest route, precautionary charging at the 70 to 80% state of charge. What you end up with is half the emission reduction. Capital expenditure doesn't really justify the returns that you're getting. Without the visibility of data, what happens is, I think, caution and anxiety becomes the default. And cautious EV operators, it doesn't really stack up commercially, the entire cost of ownership. From all these studies that we did, which the main one was that urban efficiency study, again, we really saw that trucks had a lot more outperformance over passenger cars. and light commercial vehicles. And this is because of the operational discipline. They have fixed routes, scheduled windows. They have the infrastructure that removes uncertainty. Fleets make full use of the EVs, have basically built that discipline around their data as well. So I think the investment case for EVs is pretty clear, and maybe there are three major things that I would say people need to look at over the next 3 to 5 years. One would be having very EV specific KPIs, so having a depth of discharge KPI, energy cost per route, battery state of health, alongside all of the traditional metrics as well that you've got. The second one is the driver coaching, but more than the coaching, I think it's the engagement and sentiment and understanding them and them understanding why the switch to EV is important. And I think the third one is the charging strategy. I think Edwin touched on that in one of his early comments, the infrastructure, the strategy for charging. That I think is a very capital decision. It's not just a pure logistics decision. So these would be the three things that I would let people take away, Simon.
We hear a lot about EV transition plans that look good on paper but struggle in practice. So what's the single most common reason in your experience that a transition that should work simply doesn't? And what's the fix?
I think it's not looking at every scenario, and sometimes it is just. I think we all agree on this panel that it's not just as simple that vehicle goes 80 miles a day and therefore it's a tick in the box. It is, what does that underlying strategy look like? What is that driver's insight look like? Where is he going? What is propping up that EV transition? And what it looks like commercially as well. And we do tend to focus, I think we said very, very early on really, really low mileage vehicles. And sometimes that total cost of operation just doesn't stack up because they're simply not going far enough to make a significant saving. And with the vehicles being a heavier capital cost, it then becomes a little bit of a negative thing. And I think if you're going to start from a real positive starting point, and if those first 5 or 10 EVs take more work than the next 50, do that first and spend that time and don't react. Make sure, and again, I think we've all said it is, and I heard one of our guys say earlier on in the meeting, get match ready. So prepare yourself. Even if your business or your customer base aren't putting any pressure on, make sure that everything is sort of lined up so you're ready, and you'll get a lot out of that driver. You'll get a lot more than just that EV insight. You'll get a much more positive culture. Maybe
Abhinav could deal with this one. It's for an establishment that has no EVs or EV infrastructure, where staff cannot take vehicles home. How would you recommend we start the transition to EV?
Yeah, I think the first thing we need to look at is what are the vehicles that are currently being operated with that establishment, what kind of routes that are being covered, what kind of jobs that vehicle is actually doing. So basically the vocation of that vehicle, and then figure out the transition. So we have a tool that actually helps with that. It's called the EV suitability assessment. And what it does is it looks at even things like temperature ranges within a particular city or a particular location. It looks at a like-for-like EV that can actually be used for doing the exact same job that a diesel was actually doing. Charging infrastructure, that's a much wider conversation, I would say. If you don't have your own charging infrastructure, then it's about utilizing public charging, and I guess the question was also not around home charging. So it would be around utilizing public charge, ensuring that you're going back with that depth of discharge. I would say would be that metric that you have to keep in mind. How much do you want to let the drivers go home with so they can continue their personal journey home versus do the job for the next day? So these would be the data-driven points that I would ask people to focus on.
We've been asked, is the lack of political leadership or policies around EVs continuing to cause confusion to the public and fleet managers when it comes to transitioning to e-mobility?
I think a fairly simple answer for me on this one. I think yes, policy uncertainty and changing regulatory signals do continue to create some confusion, both for individual consumers and for fleet operators. I think ultimately, directionally, the transition to e-mobility is still clear. Everyone sort of still expects that's the way things are going. It's just the pace at which it's happening, not getting stuck with legacy outdated tech, etc. That confidence is strengthened by consistency of policy, by the right signals around charging infrastructure investment, and I think clear long-term incentives as well. So yes, I'd agree.
For each of you, maybe if you could give the audience a 30-second takeaway based on the discussion we've had today, starting with Mel.
Yeah, for me, I think it's been a great discussion. I'm always keen to share experiences and share best practice. I think whatever happens politically or in this landscape, I think it's about doing the right thing for our own environment and for the future. So, and it does start with electrification. We've got more vans on the road than ever, and we spoke about London and in the cities where these diesel vans are running in very slowly. Well, I've been in London yesterday. It is very slow. So I think and for our customers, that is probably their biggest priority is carbon reduction. And we've gone out and surveyed an awful lot of them, and carbon reduction and doing the right thing, not just for their own business, but for their customers and for their suppliers. I think it is that's probably where we need to prioritize.
I think what we have to look at this is it's not just EV transition, it's more change management as well, because we're talking about people's sentiments, people's operational ability. Something they've been used to for a very long time is now being shifted. So I think we need to look at it that way. I think the data tells a part of the story, and the data helps you build that foundation on the things that need to be done. But let's not purely look at it as just purely data driven. Let's also look at it as change management and really work through all of that. So driver sentiment, driver engagement, these would be my key factors to take into account. And of course, understanding the political landscape as well.
I think for me, fleet electrification is no longer just a single vehicle by vehicle sort of cost equation or compliance response. I think it's done properly. It's genuine value creation opportunities. Organizations that will do well here will build the right operating model around the fleet. So the charging, the energy, the data, the financing, residual value management, etc. And that requires a clear roadmap by fleet segment. Where do you electrify now? Where do you wait? What to invest in? Which partners do you need to sort of collaborate with? And I think for leadership teams, the real opportunities to turn fleet electrification into a cost advantage, carbon reduction, or some sort of resilience and competitive differentiation, really.
Call it a day there, but thank you very much. It's been a very insightful discussion. Thanks very much to Abhinav Vasu from Geotab, Mel Creedy from Northgate, and Edwin Kemp from EY Parthenon. Great discussion today. Thanks very much for your time.